The early morning sun touched the old stone walls of the Vatican, giving them a soft golden glow. The place always felt peaceful at this hour, when only the quiet footsteps of a few workers and the echoes of distant bells broke the silence. Inside the large rehearsal hall, the choir members were already gathering, holding their sheets of music, adjusting their robes, and exchanging nervous smiles. They had been practicing for days, preparing for a special performance that would take place at the Vatican later that week. Their excitement was mixed with a heavy dose of anxiety, because that morning they would rehearse with a world-famous pianist. Everyone had heard about him. His talent was unmatched. His fingers could create magic on any piano he touched, and his performances were watched and admired across continents. But the choir also knew about his other reputation. He was known for being strict, impatient, and sometimes harsh. Still, they were hopeful. To share a stage with someone so gifted was an honor. Many of the choir members stayed up the night before, rehearsing alone in their rooms, humming their parts softly so they wouldn't disturb others. Some prayed for courage. Others simply wanted to get through the day without making a mistake. The pianist arrived exactly on time. The large wooden doors opened, and he walked in with confident steps, carrying nothing but a small music folder. His assistant followed him quietly, placing a bottle of water on top of the grand piano before stepping back. The pianist didn't greet anyone at first. He walked straight to the piano, lifted the cover, and ran his fingers over the keys as if checking their loyalty. The room fell silent. The choir members held their breath, waiting for him to speak. Without looking up, he finally said, "Let's begin. I hope you're all warmed up. We don't have time to waste." Several members exchanged quick glances. His tone was sharp, but no one dared to react. They lined up in their positions, holding their sheets tightly. He started by playing a complicated introduction, each note echoing through the hall with perfect clarity. Then he stopped abruptly. No, the tempo was wrong," he said before anyone even began singing. "Listen properly. This is not a casual Sunday choir rehearsal." One of the senior choir members nodded politely and said, "Of course. We'll follow your lead." The pianist raised one eyebrow. "I hope so." They tried again. This time, the choir began their part, their voices blending beautifully. But only a few seconds passed before he slammed his hands on the keys, not loudly, but enough to make everyone jump slightly. "Stop," he said sharply. "It's too soft. This is not a lullaby. Give the notes meaning." He stood and walked toward the front row of singers. His expression was not angry, but it carried an arrogance that weighed heavily on the room. "You cannot just sing words," he said, pacing slowly. "You must express them. But if expressing them is too difficult, at least sing them correctly." A few singers looked down at their sheets, embarrassed. Others tried to keep calm. They had heard stories about him, but witnessing it in person felt different. His talent seemed to give him permission, at least in his own mind, to speak without kindness. A younger choir member whispered softly to the person next to him, "Why does he talk like we're children?" The pianist overheard it. "Because you are making beginner mistakes," he said without even turning his head. "If you don't want honesty, I'm the wrong person to work with." A heavy silence filled the room. But there was someone there that the pianist had not noticed. A figure sitting quietly in the last row of chairs, partly hidden by a large pillar. The person sat calmly with hands folded, watching the rehearsal with gentle interest. It was Pope Leo XIV. He had chosen to come without announcing it. He didn't want the choir to change their natural behavior just because he was present, and he certainly didn't want the pianist to treat them differently either. He wanted to see the true dynamics of the rehearsal, and maybe understand why some members of the choir had appeared so stressed recently. From the back of the room, he observed everything, the confident way the pianist touched the piano keys, the nervous way the choir members exchanged glances, and the tension that seemed to grow heavier with every minute. The pianist returned to the piano and sighed loudly. "We'll try again. This time, please try to keep up. I promise I won't stop every 5 seconds if you do your job properly." He played the introduction again. The music filled the hall, rich and flawless. The choir entered, singing with renewed effort. They wanted to prove themselves. They wanted to show they were capable. But halfway through the verse, the pianist stopped once more. "Oh, come on," he said, rubbing his forehead. "This is painful. You are dragging the line. And you," he pointed toward a singer in the second row, "are completely off. Do you even hear yourself?" The singer lowered her head, her cheeks turning red. Another member stepped forward slightly and said, "She's trying." "We all are." The pianist shrugged. "Trying is not enough. This performance is going to be broadcast worldwide. Trying won't save you from embarrassing yourselves." The atmosphere was becoming heavier with every word he said. The choir felt more like a group of students being scolded than artists working together. The pianist, on the other hand, seemed unaware of the discomfort he was creating. He stretched his arms and added with a smirk, "Honestly, if the Pope himself were here, even he would fall asleep during this rehearsal." Suddenly, a soft sound echoed from the back of the hall, a gentle cough. The pianist stopped, confused. The choir slowly turned toward the sound. Their eyes widened. A few hands flew to mouths. One or two almost dropped their sheets. The pianist followed their gaze. Only then did he see him. Pope Leo XIV stood up calmly, offering a warm smile. The pianist froze where he was standing. His face lost its confident expression. The color in his cheeks changed as he processed the realization every word he had spoken, every impatient remark, every joke, had been witnessed by the one person he never expected. The choir remained quiet, waiting for the Pope to speak. They expected disappointment, or a correction, or maybe even a scolding for the pianist's harsh behavior. Instead, the Pope simply walked toward them, moving slowly and peacefully. His steps were gentle, as if he didn't want to disturb the atmosphere further. "Good morning," he said softly, smiling at everyone. "I hope I am not interrupting." The choir members immediately straightened up. Some whispered respectful greetings. A sense of relief washed over them, mixed with nervousness. The pianist bowed his head slightly. "Your Holiness," he said quietly, the confident tone replaced with uncertainty. But the Pope only nodded kindly, showing no sign of displeasure. "I was passing by," he said, "and I thought I would listen for a few minutes. Music has always been a great joy in my life." His words brought a calmness to the room. Even the pianist relaxed a little, though he still looked uneasy. The Pope continued, "You all have been practicing very hard, I see." The choir members smiled shyly, grateful for his acknowledgement. He then turned to the pianist, not with criticism, but with genuine curiosity. "And you," he said, "your playing is truly remarkable. It carries great strength." The pianist blinked, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he said quietly. The Pope's presence changed the air immediately. What had felt heavy and stressful now felt lighter, more human. The choir members breathed easier. Their shoulders relaxed. Even the hall seemed brighter. The Pope looked around, taking in the room softly. "If it is all right," he said, "may I sit and listen a little more?" The pianist hesitated, then nodded. "Of course," he said. The Pope returned to his seat in the back. But now he was no longer hidden. His gentle presence was known to everyone, and the atmosphere shifted completely. The choir prepared again, standing straighter. The pianist sat at the piano, but for the first time that morning, his movements carried a hint of caution. He took a slow breath and began to play. The music rose again, flowing through the hall with beauty. The choir joined in, their voices blending with more confidence. They wanted to show the Pope their best. They wanted him to feel their dedication. The pianist listened more carefully this time. He didn't stop them immediately. He didn't raise his voice. Something about the Pope's calmness seemed to soften him, even without a single correction from the Pope himself. And as the rehearsal continued, the Pope listened with a peaceful smile, seeing not just the music, but the people behind it, their effort, their nerves, their hope. He saw everything, and he understood far more than the pianist, realized that the rehearsal hall felt different after the Pope arrived. The tension that had hung in the air earlier had slowly dissolved, replaced by a quiet respect and a softer kind of focus. The choir members stood taller now, but not out of fear, rather out of a sincere desire to do their best. Even the pianist, who had entered the room with an air of superiority, now seemed more grounded. He sat at the piano again, his hands resting on the keys, but not playing yet. His eyes were fixed on the music sheets in front of him, yet his mind was clearly somewhere else. A few minutes earlier, he had joked about the Pope falling asleep during the rehearsal. Now the Pope was sitting only a few steps away, listening intently. The pianist cleared his throat quietly and said, "We start again from the beginning. Please be ready." His voice was calmer than before. The sharpness had faded. The choir members exchanged small, hopeful looks. Many of them wondered if the Pope's presence would change the rest of the rehearsal. They were right, it already had. He played the opening notes, and the choir began to sing. Their voices carried more emotion this time, more unity, more care. They knew the Pope was listening, and for them, that alone was enough reason to push themselves. Every line of the song felt alive. For once, the pianist didn't interrupt. He didn't slam the piano lid or sigh loudly. Instead, he listened. His eyes shifted from the music sheets to the faces of the singers. He studied their expressions, their effort, the sincerity in their voices. There was something he had not noticed before, something he hadn't cared to notice. Their passion. Even when their notes weren't perfect, their dedication was undeniable. They were not professionals who traveled the world like he did. They didn't play in concert halls filled with thousands of people. They were normal individuals who gave their time every week to sing, together, because they loved it. The pianist's fingers slowed, not in mistake, but in contemplation. There was something in the room he wasn't used to, a kind of warmth that didn't exist in his world of competitions. Critics and flawless performances. The choir finished the verse, and the room fell quiet. The pianist looked down, then said softly, "That was better." He paused, then added in a tone that surprised even him, "Much better." A ripple of relief spread across the choir. They hadn't expected praise, not from him. One of the older choir members stepped forward and said gently, "Thank you. We appreciate your guidance." The pianist nodded. He was not used to being thanked. Usually, people feared him or tried to impress him. Genuine gratitude was something rare in his world. He looked at them again, this time noticing small details, a trembling hand holding a sheet, a younger member biting her lip nervously, someone adjusting their robe with shaking fingers. They had been afraid of him? Truly afraid. He wasn't proud of that realization. From the back, the Pope watched this subtle change with quiet understanding. He didn't need to speak. He simply observed, allowing the moment to settle naturally. The pianist finally stood. "Let's take a short break," he said. His voice was no longer demanding. It carried the tone of someone who needed a moment to think. The choir members nodded gratefully. Some walked to the side to drink water. Others gathered in small groups, whispering to each other, relieved that the rehearsal felt less stressful now. The pianist stepped away from the piano and rubbed his hands together slowly. He glanced at the Pope, unsure whether he should walk over or stay where he was. He chose to stay away for the moment. He needed time to clear his thoughts. He walked toward a window overlooking a courtyard filled with soft sunlight. He stared outside, watching a few sparrows hop near a fountain. His chest felt tight, not in anger, not in frustration, but in an emotion he rarely felt. Embarrassment. He replayed the earlier scene in his mind, the harsh words, the impatient sighs, the unnecessary remarks. Then he remembered the moment he said the Pope would fall asleep. His stomach tightened. He had always believed his confidence was a strength, but now he wondered if it had blinded him more than it had helped him. A gentle voice broke his thoughts. "The morning light is beautiful from here, isn't it?" The pianist turned. It was one of the senior choir members, a calm and kind-faced person who had been singing in the choir for many years. "Yes," the pianist replied quietly. "It is." The choir member smiled. "You know, we are trying our best. We may not be perfect, but we care deeply about this music." The pianist nodded, feeling a weight in his chest. "I know. I was." Harsh. The choir members shook their head gently. "Sometimes pressure makes us act in ways we don't mean. It happens." They paused, then added with a soft laugh, "But you should have seen our faces when the Pope coughed." The pianist let out a small, unsure smile. "I did see. I also felt my soul leave my body for a moment." The choir member laughed warmly, easing the tension. "Don't worry. The Pope is kind. He didn't come to judge. He came to listen." The pianist looked down. "Still, I spoke without thinking. I regret it." "Then maybe this rehearsal is not just for the performance," the choir member said. "Maybe it is also for understanding each other." The pianist didn't respond immediately, but something in that simple sentence stayed with him. When the break ended, the choir returned to their places. The pianist also walked back to the piano, but before sitting, he took a slow breath and looked around the room. His expression had softened. "All right," he said. "Let us continue." But before that, he paused, searching for the right words. "I want to say something." The choir stood quietly, listening. The pianist looked at them with sincerity that surprised even him. "I know I wasn't very patient earlier. I apologize if my words made anyone uncomfortable. That was not my intention." A murmur of surprise moved through the group. The pianist? Apologizing? This was not something anyone had expected. He continued, "I am used to pushing hard for perfection. But I realize that this is not only about perfection. It's about something more." The choir members smiled at him gently. Some nodded in understanding. One of them whispered softly, "Thank you." And the pianist felt a strange warmth in his chest, an emotion he almost didn't recognize. He sat at the piano again, but this time he didn't begin immediately. He turned to the choir and said, "Let's approach it differently. Instead of worrying about mistakes, let's try to feel the words." The choir's eyes brightened. This was new. This was hopeful. He played the melody again, slower this time, letting the notes breathe. The choir joined in. Their voices rose gently, then grew stronger as they became more confident. As he played, the pianist found himself listening in a way he hadn't before. He wasn't searching for flaws. He was noticing feelings, and it changed him. He looked toward the back of the room. The Pope was still seated, hands folded, a soft smile on his face. Their eyes met for a moment. The pianist felt his cheeks warm, but the Pope gave him a small nod, as if acknowledging the change he saw. This time, the pianist didn't look away. He nodded back. The music continued, flowing through the hall in waves. The choir sang, not just with their voices, but with their hearts. And the pianist, who had built a life around precision and technique, finally allowed himself to play with emotion. At the end of the piece, Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't the heavy silence from earlier. It was a peaceful one. The pianist lowered his hands slowly, feeling a quiet ache inside him, not painful, but deep. The Pope stood up. The choir immediately straightened, but the Pope lifted a hand gently, signaling them to relax. He walked forward, stopping a few steps away from the pianist. "That was beautiful," the Pope said softly. Not because it was perfect, but because it was sincere. The pianist's breath caught slightly. He wasn't used to praise that focused on who he was, not just what he played. The Pope looked around the room. Music from the soul always shines brighter than music from the mind alone. The choir members nodded, touched by his words. The Pope turned back to the pianist. "Talent is a gift," he said gently, "but humility is what makes it meaningful." The pianist felt something shift. Inside him, something he couldn't name. The Pope placed a warm hand on the piano for a moment, as if blessing the instrument, then stepped back. "I will continue listening from here," he said with a smile. "Please carry on." And just like that, he returned to his seat. The pianist sat quietly for a moment, absorbing everything. He stared at his hands, then at the choir, then at the Pope. He took a breath. "Let's continue," he said softly. But now, he played differently, and the choir sang differently, and the rehearsal hall, already filled with history and memories, gained one more moment that no one in that room would ever forget. The rehearsal continued with a gentler rhythm, almost as if the entire room had taken a deep breath and released the weight it had been carrying. The choir members felt lighter, the pianist felt more present, and the Pope sat quietly at the back, observing every shift in tone, every small moment of growth, every expression that changed. The pianist, now seated with a calmer posture, lifted his hands again over the piano keys. But before he played, he took a moment to look around the hall. There were details he had ignored earlier, the high ceiling with its soft echoes, the sunlight slipping in through tall windows, the way dust particles floated gently in the air like tiny stars. He realized he had been too focused on control to notice beauty. He pressed the first key, letting a warm note ring through the hall. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't sharp. It carried a softness that surprised even him. The choir followed his cue, their voices rising to meet the music. This time, the sound felt fuller, not because their voices had changed, but because their confidence had returned. They were no longer afraid of the next interruption. They were singing because they wanted to. The Pope listened with patient attention, his face calm. He had always believed that music revealed more about a person than their words ever could, and he could already hear a quiet transformation taking place as the choir sang. The pianist's eyes drifted from the notes to their expressions. He noticed the younger singers who had struggled earlier. They sang now with a gentle strength, no longer flinching or shrinking back. Their voices were steady. He noticed the older members who had always carried the choir forward. Their voices layered beautifully, like a foundation built through years of dedication. For the first time since he entered the hall that morning, the pianist felt like he was part of something rather than standing above it. When the choir reached the final line of the section, their voices faded into a peaceful silence. The pianist let the last note ring out and slowly lifted his hands from the keys. Before anyone could speak, the Pope gently clapped his hands twice as soft. Respectful applause. "Wonderful," he said warmly. The choir members smiled, their faces glowing with relief and pride. Even the pianist felt a small smile tug at his lips. The Pope stood slowly and walked forward. The pianist stood instinctively, unsure what the Pope intended to say. The Pope stopped near the piano and placed a hand on its wooden edge. "Music is a language of its own," he said kindly. "It speaks to the heart before it reaches the ears. And today, I heard a change in the way you all played together. The pianist lowered his eyes slightly. He knew the Pope was referring to him as much as to the choir. The Pope continued, "We do not always realize how our words, even spoken in hurry or frustration, can shape the feelings of others. But the moment we notice, there is room for growth. And growth is a blessing." The pianist swallowed softly, feeling the weight and gentleness of the words. The Pope smiled at the choir. "You all have worked very hard, and it shows. I want you to continue with this spirit, not out of fear, but out of love for the music you share." The choir nodded, touched by his encouragement. Then the Pope turned to the pianist. "May I ask you something?" The pianist straightened. "Of course, Your Holiness. Would you mind playing something simple?" The Pope asked. "A hymn, perhaps? One that carries meaning rather than complexity." The pianist hesitated. He was known for dramatic, technically demanding compositions. Simple hymns were not usually part of his performances. Still, he nodded. "If that is what you wish, I will try." "Not try," the Pope corrected gently. "Feel." The pianist looked down at the keys, unsure how to begin. He chose a hymn he remembered from childhood, one that he had not played in years. His fingers moved slowly, searching for the melody. When the notes finally came, they were quiet, uncertain, almost shy, but they were honest. The hall fell silent, as if even the air was listening. The choir didn't sing. They simply watched. The pianist played with a kind of softness he had forgotten he was capable of. There were no flourishes, no elaborate runs, no dramatic pauses. Just a gentle melody that carried memories of simpler days. As he played, the pianist felt something stir inside him, a mix of nostalgia, vulnerability, and peace. His breath trembled slightly. He had not felt this kind of emotional connection to music in a long time. When he finished, the last note floated into the silence. The hall remained still for a moment. The Pope nodded, his eyes warm. "That," he said softly, "is what it means to play from the soul." The pianist looked down, struggling to find words. Something inside him felt exposed, yet comforted. The Pope continued, "Technique is a gift, but sincerity is a choice. When both come together, music becomes prayer." The pianist swallowed, nodding slowly. He had spent years chasing perfection, applause, and recognition. He had spent countless nights practicing until his hands shook, fearing criticism more than failure. But in that simple hymn, he felt a connection he hadn't felt in years. The Pope gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have a remarkable talent," he said. "But sometimes the most extraordinary gift is allowing yourself to be human." The pianist felt his eyes sting unexpectedly. He blinked quickly, trying to steady himself. The Pope returned to his seat, and the choir remained still, unsure whether to speak. The pianist cleared his throat and sat again, though his hands trembled slightly. "Let's continue," he said quietly. The choir returned to their positions. But everything felt different now. A wall had come down. A barrier had softened the dot the pianist played with a gentler touch. The choir sang with richer emotion. Their voices rose and fell with a unity that had not been their earlier dot as they rehearsed. A quiet bond grew between them, not spoken, not forced, but born from vulnerability and understanding. After a while, the pianist stopped and said, "May I ask something?" His voice was sincere. The choir turned toward him. "When you sing," he said softly, "what do you think about? What guides you?" It wasn't a test or a criticism. It was a genuine question. One of the choir members stepped forward slightly. "I think about the meaning of the words," they said. "I think about why we are singing, who we are singing for, and what we want the music to carry." Another added, "I think about the people listening. I want them to feel something warm, something hopeful." A third whispered, "I think about my family." Singing reminds me of them." The pianist listened carefully to each answer. Their honesty surprised him. It reminded him of how different their world was from his own, yet how similar their love for music truly was. He realized that for years he had been performing as if music were a competition. But these people, these choir members, sang as if music were a gift. He wondered when he had stopped seeing it that way. The Pope watched him, recognizing the silent reflection unfolding. The pianist took a slow breath and said, "I think I forgot why I began playing in the first place." The choir didn't respond with judgment. Instead, one of them said gently, "Then maybe this is the right place to remember." Their words sank deep. The pianist lifted his hands again. This time, he didn't rush. He didn't correct. He played, and he allowed himself to feel the notes, not control them. The choir sang with him, their voices weaving around the piano like a calming embrace. Their harmonies settled into the hall like a warm blanket. When the piece ended, the pianist leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the piano. His shoulders rose and fell slowly as he breathed out. He felt vulnerable, but not in a painful way. It felt necessary. The Pope stood again, walking toward the front. "Shall we pause here?" he asked gently. The choir nodded, and the pianist stepped back from the piano. The Pope looked at the pianist with kind eyes. "You did well," he said softly. "Healing begins when we allow ourselves to be open." The pianist lowered his gaze. "I didn't know I needed healing." The Pope smiled. "Most people don't until something reminds them." He turned to the choir. "All of you have done beautifully today. Let us rest for a moment." Music grows stronger when hearts are rested. As the choir moved to the side, chatting quietly among themselves, the pianist stepped away from the piano and leaned against the wall. Staring at the floor. He felt different, lighter, heavier, confused, and clarified all at once. He whispered to himself, "What am I doing? What have I been chasing?" The Pope watched him from across the room. The pianist didn't realize it. But the journey he was beginning, the journey of remembering, rediscovering, and reshaping, would change far more than this. Performance. It would change him. The morning after the rehearsal felt unusually quiet inside the ancient walls of the Vatican. The sunlight came in soft through the tall windows, touching the stone floors with a warm glow that made everything look peaceful. But inside the hearts of the choir members, there was anything but peace. Everyone kept thinking about the moment the famous pianist had mocked Pope Leo, and the way the Pope had responded with calm honesty. No one knew what would happen next, and the feeling of uncertainty filled the air like a heavy mist. The pianist arrived early that day, walking through the hallway with the same confident steps as always. But there was something slightly different in his expression. His face wasn't as proud as before, and his eyes didn't carry the same sharpness. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't cheerful either. It seemed like his mind had been busy all night. When he reached the rehearsal room, the choir members became silent instantly. They watched him closely, wondering if he would continue acting the same way, or if the Pope's words had touched him in some way. The pianist put his bag down, sat on the bench, and gently ran his fingers across the keys without pressing them. For a moment, his posture looked tired, maybe even unsure. Before anyone could speak, the door opened again, and Pope Leo walked in quietly. He wasn't dressed in his usual robes today. Instead, he wore a simple white shirt and a soft coat, looking more like an elderly teacher than a spiritual leader. The choir bowed respectfully, but the Pope lifted his hand softly, showing them they didn't need to stand on ceremony. "I hope everyone rested well," he said with a gentle smile. His voice carried warmth that filled the room more quickly than sunlight. The pianist looked up, and their eyes met. Unlike yesterday, he didn't try to hide his emotions. He seemed tired but open, as if ready to listen. Pope Leo walked closer and said, I know yesterday was not easy, but music has always been a place where hearts can meet, even when minds disagree. The words did something to the room. People felt the tension loosen slightly. The pianist lowered his eyes, holding on to the edge of the piano bench. The Pope turned toward him. Before we begin today, I wish to share something with you. Something I did not say yesterday. Everyone leaned in, not physically but emotionally. They could sense this moment mattered. The Pope continued, "Many years ago, when I was studying music, my teacher once told me that talent is a gift, but humility is a choice. A musician who plays only to prove he is better than others will always remain alone, no matter how great his skill. But a musician who plays to share something beautiful will never be forgotten." The pianist blinked slowly. He wasn't defensive anymore. His expression softened into something almost vulnerable. "I didn't understand this when I was young," the Pope added. "I thought skill was everything. I practiced day and night just to be admired. But life has a way of showing us what truly matters." The pianist finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "You speak as if you've lived this lesson yourself." The Pope smiled. "I have." The choir members exchanged curious glances, waiting for him to go on. "When I was a young student, I once insulted another musician," the Pope said. "Not out of anger, but out of insecurity. I thought I needed to show my worth. But later, I realized I had only shown my immaturity." A soft breath escaped from the pianist, almost like a sigh. The Pope looked directly at him and said, "Your skill is remarkable. No one doubts that. But yesterday, your words were heavier than you realized. They didn't just challenge my playing. They challenged the spirit of the choir." There was no anger in his tone, only clarity. The pianist swallowed hard. Everyone felt the weight of the moment. Then, slowly, the pianist stood up from the bench. "Was wrong," he said. The words came out quietly, but they were sincere. "I let my pride speak instead of my heart." The room remained silent, and Pope Leo nodded gently. "It takes courage to say that," the Pope replied. The pianist hesitated, then added, "I have spent my life trying to prove myself. Every performance, every competition, every rehearsal always pushing, always fighting to stay on top. But when you played yesterday, it confused me. You didn't play with perfect technique, but there was something in the sound that I couldn't ignore. Something honest." The choir members listened with wide eyes. No one expected him to confess this openly. The pianist continued, "It reminded me of when I first learned to play as a child. Back then, I played because I loved the sound, not because I needed to impress anyone." He looked at the piano, touching the keys lightly. "I don't know when I lost that." Pope Leo stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You haven't lost it. You have simply forgotten. And forgetting is human." The pianist nodded slowly, his eyes turning emotional dot. Then the Pope said something that surprised everyone. "Would you allow me to play with you?" The pianist looked up sharply. "With me?" "Yes," the Pope said. "Not in a competition, not to prove anything, but simply to make music together." The pianist stared at him in disbelief. This was the same man he had mocked the day before. Yet here he was, offering partnership instead of judgment. Finally, the pianist gave a small smile. "If you wish." The choir members looked at each other with excitement. The Pope sat beside him on the bench. Their shoulders nearly touched, and the pianist slid slightly to make space. It was a strange sight, one of the most celebrated pianists in the world, sharing a bench with a gentle, aging Pope. The pianist asked softly, "What shall we play?" The Pope thought for a moment. Something simple, something honest. They settled on a gentle duet piece that didn't require great skill, but required harmony between two players. It was a small piece, something many beginners learn. And yet, As their fingers touched the keys, the sound that filled the room was warm and deep. The Pope played with slow, steady movements, each note carrying the weight of experience. The pianist played with precise, smooth control, but for the first time in a long while, there was softness in his touch. Slowly, their sounds blended. The choir members watched with open hearts, realizing they were witnessing something rare. Two people from completely different worlds meeting at a place where ego had no place. When the final note faded, the room stayed silent for a moment. No one wanted to break the magic. The pianist looked at the Pope, and his eyes held something new. Respect. That was beautiful, he said. The Pope smiled. Music becomes beautiful when hearts listen to each other. The pianist nodded, and for the first time since arriving, he truly looked at peace. The choir members applauded softly. Not loudly, not excitedly, but warmly. Something had changed, not only in the pianist, but in everyone present. After a moment, the Pope stood and said, "Let us continue rehearsing. There is much to prepare." But now, the atmosphere was different. The tension was gone. People smiled at each other. Even the pianist looked relaxed as he took his place again. Throughout the rehearsal, he didn't raise his voice or make sharp comments. Instead, he listened, observed, and occasionally offered gentle guidance. The choir members were surprised, but grateful. Later that afternoon, when the rehearsal ended, the pianist walked up to Pope Leo. "There's something I want to ask," he said. "Of course," the Pope replied. The pianist hesitated. "Would you teach me what you played yesterday? Not the notes, but the feeling behind it?" The Pope looked at him warmly. "I can guide you, but the feeling must come from your own heart." The pianist nodded thoughtfully, as if accepting a difficult but important truth. Outside, the bells began to ring, echoing across the courtyard. The Pope smiled and said, "Come tomorrow. We will begin then." For the first time in years, the pianist felt like a student again, not in a humiliating way, but in a hopeful one. And deep inside, he knew this was the beginning of something unexpected, something that would change him forever. The next morning arrived with a gentle calmness, as if the entire Vatican was breathing a little easier after the events of the previous days. The early light shone through the tall windows, painting long golden lines across the quiet hallways. The atmosphere felt different, not heavy, not tense, but thoughtful. Something in the air had shifted, like the world was waiting for the next step in a story that had already surprised everyone. The famous pianist walked through the corridor with a quieter posture. Gone was the sharp confidence that used to show in his steps and eyes. Instead, his movements were slow, almost careful, like he was holding something fragile inside his heart. No one mocked him, and no one looked at him with judgment. The choir members simply watched him with curiosity, respect, and a bit of admiration. They had seen him change right in front of them. And that kind of transformation touches people more than any grand performance. When he entered the rehearsal room, he found the Pope already there, sitting on a simple wooden chair near the window. Sunlight fell across the Pope's shoulders, making him look even more peaceful. He was reading a small music notebook. Turning the pages gently. The pianist stopped at the door for a moment, unsure whether to speak or wait. The Pope looked up and smiled warmly. "Good morning. I'm glad you came early." The pianist stepped forward. "You asked me to come. I didn't want to be late." The Pope placed the notebook aside. "Today is not a lesson in technique. It is a lesson in understanding." The pianist nodded softly, though he didn't yet know what that meant. The Pope stood and walked to the piano. "Come, sit." The pianist sat on the bench. The Pope stood beside him, but didn't touch the keys yet. He said, "Before you play, tell me, what do you hear when you imagine music?" The pianist froze. It was such a simple question, but his mind didn't know how to answer immediately. He swallowed. I hear patterns, structure, sound that must be shaped correctly. The Pope smiled gently. And what do you feel? The pianist looked down. For years, he hadn't allowed himself to feel anything when playing. Feelings were messy, unreliable, not useful in competitions. I'm not sure, he admitted. The Pope nodded. Then today, we begin not with your hands, but with your heart. The pianist looked confused, but curious. Close your eyes, the Pope said softly. The pianist hesitated, then obeyed. The room felt warmer with his eyes closed, as if the sounds of the world became clearer. Think of the first time you played the piano. The Pope whispered. The pianist's breath trembled slightly. A forgotten memory pulled itself up like a small boat, rising to the surface of water. He saw a small room. A wooden piano. A kind, older woman guiding his hands gently. He remembered laughing when he hit the wrong notes, not being scolded, but encouraged. He remembered joy, simple, pure, unpressured joy. His eyes opened without warning. A soft ache filled his chest. I haven't thought about that in years, he said quietly. The Pope nodded. This is where your music began. Not in fame, not in pressure, not on any stage. It began with a moment of love. The pianist took a long breath. Something inside him loosened. Now, the Pope said gently, play something, anything, not to impress, not to prove. Play only what you feel from that memory. The pianist placed his hands on the keys. At first, they trembled slightly. He wasn't used to playing without purpose or perfection. But then he closed his eyes again, let the memory guide him, and pressed the first note. It was soft, almost hesitant, then another, and another. He wasn't playing a known piece. He wasn't following sheet music. He was simply letting the sound come from inside. The Pope listened without moving. The choir members who had arrived early stood silently at the back, watching a moment that felt almost sacred. The pianist's melody grew slowly gentle, warm, fragile. It wasn't flawless. Some notes were uneven, some hesitated, but there was something fresh in the sound. It was human. When he finished, he let his hands fall into his lap. His eyes opened, and there was moisture in them. I didn't know I could still play like that, he whispered. Pope Leo placed a hand on his shoulder. You never lost it. You only buried it. The pianist lowered his head. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. Something inside him had shifted. The Pope continued. Technique is the body of music, but feeling is its soul. When you mocked me that first day, you played with your body, but not your soul. Yesterday, when we played together, your soul began to wake up. The pianist looked at him with humility. I'm trying. And that is enough for today, the Pope replied. The rest of the choir entered, filling the room with gentle chatter. When they saw both the Pope and the pianist standing near the piano, they gathered quickly. The Pope turned to them. Today, we will rehearse differently. We will not focus on perfection. We will focus on unity. The pianist helped guide the choir, but not with strictness this time. His instructions were gentler, more patient. He listened closely, noticing details he had ignored before, not just pitch, but emotion. He began to understand why the Pope valued the choir so deeply. Their voices blended with new warmth. Even the shy singers sounded more open today. After an hour, the Pope asked the pianist to play a piece alone so the choir could practice their timing with it. The pianist hesitated. For the first time, he was nervous, not because he feared failure, but because he wanted his music to come from a truer place. He sat at the piano. The room grew quiet. He began to play a classical piece he had mastered long ago. But this time, something was different. The notes were deep, rich, and full of expression he had never allowed himself to show. The choir watched him with admiration. Some even smiled. The Pope listened with his eyes closed, a soft smile on his face. When the pianist finished, the room felt changed again. The Pope said gently, "Now you are not just playing the piano. You are speaking through it." The pianist lowered his head, moved by the unexpected compliment. After rehearsal ended, the choir members gathered around him, thanking him and telling him how beautiful the music sounded. Their kindness surprised him. He wasn't used to such warmth. That one of the older choir members said, "You look lighter today, happier." The pianist blinked, caught off guard. "Do I?" "Yes," she said with a smile. "Your shoulders are not carrying the same weight." He touched his shoulder unconsciously. It was true. He felt lighter. The Pope approached him again. "I have something to ask of you." The pianist straightened slightly. "Anything." "Tomorrow," the Pope said, "I want us to play a piece together again. But this time for the entire choir. I want them to hear what humility and harmony sound like when they meet." The pianist felt a warm flutter in his chest. "I would be honored." The Pope smiled. "Good, and rest well today. Your heart will need strength for what comes next." The pianist nodded with gratitude. He left the rehearsal room with a quiet smile. As he walked through the courtyard, he noticed the sunlight felt different, softer, warmer, as if the world itself was welcoming his change. That night, he sat at the small desk in his room. Instead of practicing scales or preparing for competitions, he wrote gentle lines, flowing melodies. Filled with emotion he had kept locked away for years. As the notes took shape on the page, he realized he wasn't writing for the world or for fame. He was writing for himself, and something deep inside whispered, "Tomorrow might change almost everything." The next morning began with a quiet energy that felt almost like a hidden celebration. The air around the Vatican seemed lighter, as if the old walls themselves were aware that something meaningful was about to happen. The sky was soft with early light, and birds sang in the courtyard, their voices echoing gently through the stone corridors. The pianist woke earlier than usual. He sat on the edge of his bed with both hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, staring at the music sheets he had written the night before. The melodies still felt fresh in his mind, soft but hopeful, like a conversation he wasn't ready to end. He ran a hand through his hair and took a deep breath. Today mattered to him in a way he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't a performance for fame or glory. It wasn't a competition. It was something else, something honest. He stood, straightened his clothes, and made his way through the quiet hallways toward the rehearsal room. As he walked, he noticed the artworks, the statues, the tall pillars, things he had overlooked before. Today, they felt connected to him. Or maybe he felt connected to them. When he reached the rehearsal room, the door was slightly open. Inside, the Pope was already there, sitting at the piano. He wasn't playing, just resting his hands lightly on the keys, as if greeting them like old friends. The pianist paused at the door, watching him. The Pope looked peaceful, lost in thought. He stepped inside gently. "Good morning." The Pope turned and smiled with a warmth that instantly eased him. "Good morning. I was hoping you'd arrive early." The pianist walked closer. "I wanted to prepare. Today feels important." "It is," the Pope said softly. "Not because of the music itself, but because of what the music will show." The pianist nodded. "I worked on something last night. It came from a place I haven't listened to in a long time." The Pope's eyes softened. "Would you like to share it with me?" The pianist hesitated. For the first time in many years, he felt shy about showing his own music. But he took a breath, sat beside the Pope, and placed the sheets gently on the stand. He began to play. The melody rose gently, simple and sincere. Each note held warmth, a quiet story, a memory, and a bit of vulnerability. It wasn't a masterpiece meant for grand audiences. It was something deeply human. The Pope listened with closed eyes, his expression soft and peaceful. When the pianist finished, he felt his heart beating faster. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. The Pope opened his eyes and smiled. "I think this is your true voice. Not loud, not proud, but honest." The pianist felt a warmth rise in his chest. He looked down at the keys, letting those words settle inside him. After a moment, the Pope said, "Shall we prepare for the choir?" The pianist nodded. "Yes, I'm ready." Soon, the choir members began arriving. They entered with cheerful greetings, warm smiles, and excited eyes. Many had come earlier than usual, sensing that today's rehearsal would be different. The Pope stood before them and said, "Today, I want you all to witness something special. But before that, let us rehearse your parts." The choir arranged themselves and began singing. Their voices filled the room with a gentle unity that felt deeper than the day before. The pianist played along, guiding their timing, but he was softer now, listening more than leading. After some time, the Pope raised his hand. "Now," he said gently, "I would like everyone to sit." The choir settled into their chairs, curious and excited. The Pope turned to the pianist. "Shall we show them what harmony looks like when it comes from the heart?" The pianist nodded. They sat side by side on the piano bench. A silence settled across the room, calm, expectant, warm. The Pope placed his hands on the lower keys. The pianist placed his hands on the higher keys. Their shoulders touched lightly. Then they began to play, the room filled with a soft, do-it-gentle, flowing, steady. The Pope's notes carried wisdom, patience, and warmth. The pianist's notes carried precision, expression, and new humility. Together, they created a sound richer than anything the choir had heard before. It wasn't grand. It wasn't powerful. It was pure. Halfway through the piece, something unexpected happened. The pianist felt emotion rise in him, not the kind that overwhelms, but the kind that frees. As he played, he realized the music was no longer about proving anything. It was about sharing something real. The Pope, feeling that shift, smiled without looking away from the keys. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was deep. No one wanted to break it. Then, slowly, the choir began to clap, not loud or rushed, but soft and full of respect. The pianist lowered his head slightly. Overwhelmed. One choir member said softly, "That was beautiful." Another added, "It felt like a story." The pianist looked up, and his eyes were shining. He had not felt this kind of appreciation in many years, the kind that wasn't about skill, but sincerity. The Pope turned to face him. "This is what I wanted you to see," he said gently. "Music becomes powerful not when it is perfect, but when it is true." The pianist nodded, his voice low. "I understand now." The Pope placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have a gift, but your heart is the real performer." The pianist inhaled slowly, letting those words settle deep inside him. After a short break, the choir rehearsed again. But now something had changed. Their voices were bolder, warmer, more connected. They weren't just singing, they were expressing. And the pianist helped them with genuine patience, offering gentle suggestions, praising their improvements, and encouraging them with a kindness they had never expected from him. When the rehearsal ended, everyone stayed behind a little longer, talking and laughing softly. The room felt lighter, filled with a sense of unity. Later, as the pianist walked toward the courtyard, the Pope joined him. "May I walk with you?" The Pope asked. The pianist nodded. "Of course." They stepped outside. The courtyard was glowing with warm afternoon sunlight. Birds hopped around the stone paths, and the air carried the faint scent of flowers. They walked slowly. After a moment, the Pope said, "Do you know what surprised me the most?" The pianist looked at him curiously. "What?" That you allowed yourself to change, the Pope replied. Most people protect their pride so tightly that they never discover what they're meant to become. The pianist took a deep breath. I didn't change alone. You guided me. The Pope smiled. I only opened a door. You chose to walk through. They walked in silence for a moment, listening to the sounds around them.